Hi everyone, hearty welcome to the lectures on the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. So far we have seen two letters of Paul, namely Romans and Galatians, which are two of the four great letters of Paul. Now the other two great letters of Paul are 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. So now let us study about the 1 Corinthians. I would like to give you the outline or the points that we are going to discuss. I will begin the letter with a brief introduction to the letter, followed by background of the city of Corinth and Paul's visit to Corinth and the establishment of the Corinthian church. Then Paul's relation with the Corinthians and the Corinthian church. Then the conflict in the community. Then we shall also discuss about the vocation and purpose of the 1 Corinthians. What was the context in which Paul had written this letter and for what purpose? Then let us discuss about the authenticity, authorship, date and place of the composition of the letter. Then we shall have another point for our discussion, that is textual issues or the origins of the letter. And let's conclude this part 1 with the synopsis of 1 Corinthians. So this is the outline for the part 1 of the study of 1 Corinthians. Now let me begin with a brief introduction to the letter. Now 1 Corinthians is one of the lengthy and comprehensive letters of Paul. It has 16 chapters. Then 1 Corinthians is more practical letter, while Romans is more thematic. 1 Corinthians is practical because throughout the letter Paul discusses or responds to the practical problems that were existing in the Corinthian community. Of course, along with it, he also brings out his theology. Then 1 Corinthians witnesses that gospel and Hellenism come into close contact with each other in Corinth. And it also testifies to the beginning of faith in a new world or in a Hellenistic world. So that is to say, the message of the gospel crosses the boundaries of Judea or Judaism and gets a universal outlook. So now the gospel reaches beyond Judaism. So here Paul brings good news to the Gentile world or Hellenistic world. So that is how the gospel has a universal outlook. Now the study of the first letter is very important because it gives many a detail about the life of the early church, especially in the middle of the first century. It gives many details about the phase of the early church. So that is very important to study and to know about the life of the first Christian churches. Then understanding of early Christian teaching. It gives many teachings about the Christian doctrine according to the understanding of the early church. In this letter, especially the teaching on the Eucharist and on the resurrection of the body, because some of the Corinthians, some of the believers That is because of the influence of Hellenistic philosophy. Some were not believing in the bodily resurrection. And also the letter illustrates the mind and character of Paul. So we come to know more about the personality of Paul, his understanding, his mind, his character, as well as his philosophy and theology. So the letter is also very important for its doctrinal teaching. Now, as I said in the very beginning, that it is more practical letter because it deals with the practical problems that were existing in the church. Now I would like to give you the summary of the entire letter in view of discussing the problems that were existing. Now, in chapters 1 to 4, the letter discusses about the problem of divisions in the Corinthian church. What were these divisions or dissensions? Corinthians were identifying themselves as followers of Paul, as followers of Apollos, as followers of Peter, and as followers of Christ. Let me read for you chapter 1, verses 10. Paul writes, I appeal to you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no dissensions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. Verse 11. For it has been reported to me by close people that there is quarreling among you, my brethren. Verse 12. What I mean is that each one of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Verse 13. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? So this is how Paul responds to the dissensions and the divisions that were existing in the Corinthian church. So Paul clearly mentions that there be no dissensions among the Corinthians, but that they may united in the same mind and the same judgment. Now in chapters 5 to 7, the letter discusses about the problem of sexual immorality. Sexual immorality among Christians. Paul comes to know that there was a man living with his father's wife. So it was a case of incest. So Paul immediately excommunicates the man, and Paul invites the community to live in sincerity and truth. And Paul also addresses in these chapters 5 to 7 the issue of legal conflicts in pagan courts of law. So Christian believers were approaching the pagan courts for judgment. Then Paul also discusses in these chapters marriage, especially the use of sex, the understanding of sex in marriage, and also the attitude of unmarried and the married people. Now in chapters 8 to 10, the letter discusses about the problem of eating meat offered to idols in the local pagan temples, something connected to the pagan temple sacrifices. So Paul here discusses about the idol worship and eating meat offered to idols. Coming to chapters 11 to 14, the letter discusses about the problem that was existing in the worship gathering of the Corinthian community. As the Corinthians were gathering for the worship of the Eucharist or breaking of the bread, there were discriminations in fellowship meal, discriminations between the rich and the poor. Rich were not leaving the food for the poor or those who come late. And here in these chapters, Paul also discusses about the charisms or the spiritual gifts that we receive. And finally, in the same section, Paul also exhorts women to cover their head and keep silence in the churches. And in the final chapters, chapter 15 and chapter 16, the letter discusses about the problem of Jesus' resurrection. As I said already, some believers were denying the general bodily resurrection, and so Paul treats about this in these chapters. So thus Paul in this letter responds to the questions addressed to him either by way of the letter or that Paul comes to know through some other people, some visitors. Paul was in Ephesus at the time of writing this letter. So Paul gets information about these problems and issues that were existing in the Corinthian community. And so through this letter, Paul responds to them. Then finally, in the general introduction to the letter, I would like to say that the study of the First Corinthians is very much relevant even today, as it was throughout the history of the church. I would like to quote, First Corinthians reveals more about the struggles and conditions of a young apostolic church than any other New Testament letter. It gives a clear picture of the wide range of pressures that the earliest Christians had to face, pressures both from within their communities and from their surrounding pagan environment. Paul shows himself sensitive to these challenges throughout the letter and offers spiritual direction that is sometimes bold and confrontational, but always full of charity and fatherly wisdom. Because the problems in ancient Corinth are problems that plague the church in every age, this letter was the most widely cited of Paul's letters in early Christianity, and it continues to speak to our situation today. So it is very clear that the same problems that Corinthians were having at the time of Paul, the same problems are also exist even in our today's context, in our today's church. And so First Corinthians is a blessing, very much relevant to deal with these problems. And so the study of First Corinthians is very important. Now, second point I would like to discuss with you is about the city of Corinth. Now, this is very important. The study of the ancient Corinth is very important in view of understanding the entire letter. So let us deal this point a bit in detail. Now, city of Corinth. The ancient Corinth, now it is found in modern Greece. It was in the province of Achaia and it was 50 miles from Athens, and it was very powerful and very prosperous commercial center. It was the center for trade and manufacturing, especially known for bronze works and polished mirrors. Corinth was a major port city in the ancient world. That is why commerce business flourished very much. In fact, Corinth had two major harbors or ports, so which made Corinth extremely wealthy. Once the harbors are there, ships pass through. So along with this, many people travel for business or commerce. And Corinth also was a short route to Europe, Italy, especially to Rome. So it was a cosmopolitan city attracting all kinds of people like Greeks, Romans, Syrians, Egyptians, and Jews. Now, talking about Jews, many Jews might have come to Corinth at the expulsion of Claudius from Rome because of the issue of a particular person called Christus, or that is Christ. And also, since it was a commercial and business city, so merchants, envoys, pilgrims also, and other travelers passed through the city. So the city kept itself always very busy. Now, the ancient city of Corinth was very famous under Greeks. Before Romans, Greeks ruled. So under Greeks, the city of Corinth was very famous, especially from 8th century to 5th century BC. So under Greeks, the city of Corinth flourished very much. It was very famous and well known. But later, it was occupied and completely destroyed by the Romans. So when Romans came into power, they have occupied the city of Corinth and completely destroyed by Romans under Lucius Mummius. And this occupation and destruction happened in 146 BC. Now, the city of Corinth was rebuilt later by Julius Caesar as a Roman colony in 46 to 44 BC, and he renamed it as Colonia Laus Julia Corinthiensis, that is to say, Corinth, the praise of Julius. Then from 27 BC, the city of Corinth became the capital of the imperial province of Achaia. Now, as we have already said, Corinth was a cosmopolitan city. So it had at a time about 700,000 inhabitants, of which 2/3 were slaves, that is about 500,000. And it had a mixed population of Romans, Greeks, and Jews, and many others. So thus it became the center of cultures. Now, the city was full of pagan cults of the gods of Egypt, of the gods of Rome and Greece. One of them was a temple dedicated to Aphrodite, goddess of love, or same goddess is Aphrodite for Greeks and Venus for Romans. So Aphrodite was known as goddess of sex and pleasure. It is a mythological goddess born of sea, it is said. And so the temple had 1,000 cult prostitutes serving in the temple. So it was a ritual prostitution. The temple had sexual license, that is sexual immorality. Of course, at the time of Paul, the temple was in ruins, and so but the prostitution continued down in the streets of Corinth. And other temples in Corinth include ones like the temple to Apollo, temple to Hermes, temple to Venus Fortuna. Then there was a temple dedicated to Isis, and also there is another temple dedicated to all the gods known as Pantheon, and many other temples. So it is because of this temple and the temple prostitution, because of its character of sexual immorality, the Corinth appeared to be Vanity Fair at the time of Paul, and it was politically and economically wealthy and prosperous, but Corinth had a reputation for vice because of this sexual immorality. Now, because of this, also Corinth had known for its own particular character, or known as Corinthian character, among the Mediterranean cities. So Corinth developed a reputation widespread throughout the ancient world for sexual license, that is sexual immorality. To live like the Corinthians meant to fornicate or promote the trade of prostitution and to have very loose morals, so to practice sexual immorality. So thus Corinth became synonymous for immorality, of which Paul often spoke. We have references in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 20 and 2 Corinthians 12, 20 to 21. Then Corinth also was known for Isthmian games, similar to the Olympic Games. These Isthmian games were conducted every 2 years. There was a place called Isthmus very close to Corinth, and these Isthmian games were held there. And these games were held in honor of Poseidon, ruler of the sea and a deity of ancient Greece. Of course, these Isthmian games began because of the influence of Romans. Now, these Isthmian games drew large crowds of people. People used to come from different parts of the world to watch these games, as well as the sportsmen, the participants. So, it is also possible and believed that Paul was present here as a tent maker during the Isthmian games of 51 and 52 AD. And in the two letters of Paul to Corinthians, very clear allusions to those different aspects of Corinthian history is noticed, especially about its slavery, prostitution, and also these Isthmian sports. So overall, the city of Corinth was famously known for business, Isthmian games, and known for different cultic worships. Now in 19th century, excavations of the city were taken up, and to some extent the excavations are going on even today. So these excavations have uncovered many significant findings. I would like to mention few of them. First one, Jewish synagogue. As we see in Acts of the Apostles 18:4, Paul was arguing in the Jewish synagogue every Sabbath. That means there was a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue in the city of Corinth at the time of Paul. And as we have already said, many Jews lived there in the first century. And Paul, as was his custom, as we see in Acts 17:2, Paul, wherever he went, he begins his announcing the gospel in the synagogues. So it was his custom. So Paul would have come here first in this Jewish synagogue to announce the gospel of Christ. Secondly, the numerous pagan temples were uncovered, excavated, with the dining rooms in which banquets to honor the gods were celebrated. A reference made to this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 verse 10. Thirdly, the meat markets where meat from sacrifices was sold. After the animal sacrifices in the pagan temples, the rest of the meat was brought to the meat markets for sale. A reference is made to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 25. Now, during these excavations, the platform in the forum where Paul's trial before the governor of Gallo also was discovered. Gallo was a proconsul of Achaia between 51 and 53 AD when Paul was there. So there is a reference to this in Acts of the Apostles chapter 18 verses 12 and 17. Now this platform is known as Bema or judgment seat. Thus Paul refers to judgment seat of Christ in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 9 to 10. Next, the rows of small shops like the leather working shops of Aquila and Prisca in which Paul worked. So the rows of small shops were also unearthed, discovered during these excavations. There is a reference to these working shops in Acts 18 1 to 3 and 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 3 to 6 and verse 12. Finally, the type of houses in which the Corinthian Christian community must have gathered for its fellowship, worship, meetings, and for other spiritual gatherings. There is a reference to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 17 to 22, verses 33 to 34, and chapter 16 verse 19. Now let us discuss about Paul's visit to Corinth and the Corinthian church. According to Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, 1, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Let us read Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, verses 1 to 4. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked. For by trade they were tent makers. And Paul argued in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded Jews and Greeks. So according to Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, verses 1 to 4, Paul, after his ministry in Athens, he went to Corinth. The full episode of Paul's mission at Corinth can be read in Acts 18, 1 to 18. So after his preaching at Athens, Paul had come to Corinth, probably end of 51 AD, and as we have heard, first in the beginning he argued or he preached the gospel in the synagogue at Corinth, and later he founded the church. So in this important commercial and famous city, and all this happened during his second missionary journey, and he was accompanied by his fellow workers, co-workers, Timothy and Silas. So, and Paul had spent there a year and 6 months, according to Acts of the Apostles chapter 18 verse 11 gives that details. And Paul stayed a year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. So with the exception of Ephesus, Paul stayed at Corinth longer than any other city that he visited. He stayed with Aquila and Priscilla, the tent makers, the same trade of that of Paul, who have come to Corinth from Rome, Italy. So when Emperor Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Acts of the Apostles 18, 2 and 3 verses. Now Paul, he was so much impressed by this city because no fear of persecutions. Probably he left Athens and came because the word of God was not heard, and probably Paul might have had also undergone a sort of persecutions there. So that is why he left Athens without founding the church and came to Corinth. So when he came here in Corinth, Paul argued in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded Jews and Greeks. And later, when Jews did not heed to him, when Jews did not accept the gospel of Jesus Christ, so Paul went to the Gentiles, as we see in chapter 18 of Acts of the Apostles, verse 6. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." So thus, first the gospel was introduced to the Jews in the synagogue, but they did not accept, and so Paul went to Gentiles to announce the good news. Thus, Paul founded the Christian community at Corinth, and Christian community in Corinth consists of rich, middle and poor, and probably Corinth had as many as 150 to 200 Christians at the time of writing this letter. Some of them were Jews, but probably most of them were Gentile converts, because as we have said, the Jewish people rejected the gospel. Now how the establishment of the church began there. Paul had great success with the conversion of Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. So, the ruler of the synagogue was converted to Christianity along with his household, and it is also said many of the Corinthians believed in the gospel and were baptized. So we read this information in Acts 18:8 as well as 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 26. So Crispus was baptized by Paul himself, as it is referred in 1 Corinthians 1:14. And Paul also had a great success with the conversion of another ruler of the synagogue, namely Sosthenes. The name of Sosthenes is found here in 1 Corinthians 1:1 and also Acts of the Apostles 18:17 as the ruler of the synagogue. Now, Paul came to Corinth, announced the gospel, and established the church. Now, after Paul's departure, Apollos, a native Jew of Alexandria, who was an eloquent man, well versed in the scriptures, fervent in spirit, spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus. So he arrived in Corinth after Paul's departure, and he greatly helped the believers there to grow in their faith and in Christian doctrines. And at the same time, he proved to be wrong the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. This episode can be found in Acts of the Apostles chapter 18, 24 to 28. Also, in this letter, Paul acknowledges the work and ministry of Apollos in chapter 3 verses 5 to 8. Paul, after establishing the church, he went to Ephesus. At the time of writing this letter, Paul was in Ephesus. We will come to know that when we discuss about the date and place of composition of this letter. Now, while he was in Ephesus, Paul is aware from a number of sources. We will also discuss about in the coming sections what are these sources from which Paul comes to know about the problems in Corinth. So many of them were in danger of returning to vices of their former lives, and so Paul writes this letter to encourage them in faith. And Paul deals with the issues of false teachers, and he also does not hesitate to tackle problems of sexual immorality, lawsuits, the Lord's Supper, and resurrection, while also answering the questions about marriage, eating food offered before the idols, and also socializing between Jews and Gentile Christians. And he also discusses about the spiritual gifts and worship. And also, this letter includes Paul's theme on love. Chapter 13 is dedicated to this theme. Now, as a fourth point, let us discuss about Paul's relations with the Corinthian church. Now, after Ephesus, we said Corinth is the place where Paul stayed longer, and so his relation, his affinity, affection with the Corinthians must be very close and cordial. So, after founding the church in Corinth, Paul made 2 visits, and as well he exchanged letters with the Corinthian Christian community. About his letters we find in 1 Corinthians 7:1 and 2 Corinthians 2:4. So naturally his relations with them were very close and cordial, as we see in 2 Corinthians 6:11 to 13 and chapter 7 verses 2 to 4. Let us read 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 11 to 13. Our mouth is open to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted in your own affections. In return, I speak as to children. Widen your hearts also. Let's also read chapter 7 verses 2 to 4. Paul writes, open your hearts to us. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. we have taken advantage of no one. I do not say this to condemn you, for I said before that you are in our hearts to die together and to live together. So also verse 4, I have great confidence in you, I have great pride in you, I am filled with comfort with all our affection, I am overjoyed. So these two particular references from 2 Corinthians point out that the relation that Paul had with Corinthians was very close and very cordial. So he knew the Corinthian community very well. But at the same time, there were tensions, frictions in these relations between Paul and Corinthians, and these tensions were caused by super apostles or false teachers who came to Corinth, probably from Judea, as we have a reference to them in 2 Corinthians chapter 11-15, and also the offender who at once challenged Paul. So when Paul visited Corinth at a later time, so there was an offender who at once attacked and challenged Paul, which is referred in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verses 5 to 11. Now let us discuss about the next point on conflict in the community. Now Paul's letters to the Corinthian Christians reflect challenges facing the early church. Now these challenges are due to the impact of Christianity on its pagan environment. So because the Corinthians lived in large complex households and worshipped in house churches, now that reflected the city's diverse makeup, unity within diversity was an important issue. So other key issues were leadership and authority, ritual practices, lifestyles and relationships. So all struggled with what it means to be made new in Jesus Christ. Now amidst these conflicts, Paul tried to address all these issues and problems and to reconcile the conflicts that arose by calling for unity in the body of Christ. The first and second letters to Corinthians are invaluable for the light they throw not only on the practical problems of a primitive community, primitive church, but also on the personality of Paul. Now let us discuss about the occasion and purpose of the first Corinthians. What was the context, what was the need out of which Paul had written this letter, and for what purpose the letter was written. Now the occasion of this letter is the information that Paul received from two different sources about the Christians of Corinth. As I've already said, at the time of writing this letter, Paul was in Ephesus. So Paul received some news, some information about the Corinthian community from two sources. The first source is the report given by close people who came back to Ephesus from Corinth after their business trip. So along with them, they bring the news about the Corinth church. Let us read chapter 1 verses 11 and 12. For it has been reported to me by close people that there is quarreling among you, my brethren. What I mean is that each one of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. So close people who went to Corinth for a business trip and who came back to Ephesus, so they brought the news about the Corinthian church, about the dissensions, about the divisions that were existing in Corinthian church. So this is the first source, a report given by close people who came back to Ephesus from Corinth after their business trip. Now Paul was at Ephesus during his third missionary journey, as we see in Acts chapter 19 and 1 Corinthians 16, 8 to 19. So they informed Paul, these close people informed Paul about the disorders or factions or divisions or dissensions that were existing in the Corinthian community. Now the second source is the letter mentioned in 7:1, probably brought to Paul by Stephanas and others whose names are mentioned in chapter 16 verse 17. Let's look at chapter 7 verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. Okay, what we are interested with the first part of that verse. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, that means Corinthians have written a letter to Paul expressing their concerns, their worries. So this is the second source from which Paul comes to know the existence of the problems in Corinthian community. So 7:1, there is an indication that Corinthians themselves have written a letter to Paul presenting some of the problems in the community, and of course asking for clarifications or seeking advice on several problems in the Corinthian church. Now the people of Corinth wanted clarifications about issues like marriage, virginity, eating meat offered before the idols of other religions. So divisions in the church, sexual immorality, lawsuits among believers. So these were some of the problems that the people of Corinth wanted to get clarifications about. So that is the letter that Corinthians had written to Paul seeking for advice, exhortations and clarifications. So their report pointed out some basic flaws in the Corinthian understanding of Christianity. So it was against this background that Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthian Christians answering their questions and trying to bring them to a true appreciation of an authentic life in Christ. Now let us discuss about the authenticity, authorship, date and place of the letter. Now with regard to the authenticity and authorship, now it is universally accepted that Paul is the author of this letter, which he wrote to the church of Corinth. He himself had founded. References to 1 Corinthians 4:14 to 15, chapter 9 verses 1 to 2, 2 Corinthians 10:13 to 14, and also Acts of the Apostles chapter 18. So Paul founded Christian community at Corinth during his second missionary journey, that is in 51 and 52 AD. Now the personal characteristics of Paul, the style of Greek language and the structure of the letter serve as an internal evidence to say that it is a composition of Paul. And as we see in the history of the church, Clement of Rome mentions this letter. Ignatius of Antioch imitates the language of 1 Corinthians. And then I would like to quote C.K. Barrett, who writes, "The evidence of its use in the early church is older, clearer, and more widespread than that for any other book of the New Testament." So it is believed that Paul wrote this letter himself, and he wrote it most probably in the spring of 54 or 55 AD and from Ephesus, 1 Corinthians 16:8. Now let us discuss about the textual issues that we find in these letters, both 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. So let's discuss about the topic textual issues, or otherwise the origins of the letter. The New Testament only contains 2 letters to the Corinthians. Now, as we have in our Bibles, we have only 2 letters. First letter to the Corinthians and the second letter to the Corinthians. So we have only 2 letters. But according to some modern scholars, there is an evidence from the letters themselves, so as an internal evidence, that Paul wrote at least 4 letters to Corinthians. So since Paul had a good and long standing relation with the Corinthian community, with the Corinthian Christians, so Paul must have written to them a number of times. Now what are these 4 letters could be? First one, a letter now lost but referred to in 1 Corinthians 5:9. So this we can call it as letter A. So let's see 1 Corinthians 5:9. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral men. So Paul here mentions that I wrote to you in my letter. So that means before writing this First Corinthians, Paul had written a letter previously. So a letter now lost, but referred to it in First Corinthians chapter 5 verse 9. So it is a warning letter against the relationships with the sinners and the sexually immoral. So in this letter, Paul deals with the problem of sexual immorality, and this refers to an early letter, sometimes also called the warning letter. And now, is it completely lost? According to the scholars, the parts of this lost letter might have been preserved in First Corinthians chapter 6 verses 12 to 20 and in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 14 to chapter 7 1. So this letter, early letter Paul had written to Corinthians, was not lost, but in course of time, that letter is incorporated into these two letters that we have presently. Now, what is the second letter? Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. So that we can call it as a letter B. So the first letter that we have now at present in our Bibles is considered as the second letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. Now this letter addresses specific questions raised in a letter sent from Corinth, which is mentioned in 7:1. We have already referred. So in 7:1 we have seen that Corinthians have written a letter to Paul asking some questions for clarifications. So in response to that letter, Paul had written this letter. And this letter discusses even more serious issues which are reported by Paul by the letter as well as by visitors from Corinth. We have already referred, there were two sources from which Paul comes to know the serious issues, from close people and the letter written by the Corinthians. So in response to these two sources, Paul writes this letter. So Paul wrote this letter in response to the letter sent from Corinth. Now some of the problems mentioned are the following in this letter: the value of virginity and celibacy, meat offered to idols, the use of charisms or spiritual gifts, abuses in the liturgical assemblies and in the celebration of the Lord's Supper, and the issues of the resurrection. Now what is letter 3, the third letter? Now after the second letter, Titus visits Corinth with the double purpose of restoring order in the community and of initiating the collection for Jerusalem church. So after Paul's writing this second letter, that is for us in our Bibles the first letter, so Paul sends Titus to Corinth for two purposes. One is to restore the order in the community, because there were dissensions, fractions and divisions in the community. We have already said that. And the second reason why Titus was sent to Corinth was to collect the financial help for the Jerusalem church. But Titus finds himself unable to achieve his goal. And while Titus was still in Corinth, Paul visits and the outcome is very negative. So even after Paul's coming to Corinth, the Corinthians treated Paul very negatively. So in disappointment, Paul goes back to Ephesus and sends a letter, which we can call a letter C. So this is known as a stern letter or letter of tears, which is referred to in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verses 3 to 4 and chapter 7 verses 8 to 12. Let us have a look at these references. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 3 to 4. Paul writes, "And I wrote as I did, so that when I came I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice, for I felt sure of all of you, that my joy would be the joy of you all. For I wrote you out of much affliction and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. Now let's read chapter 7, verses 8 and 12. Chapter 7, verse 8. For even if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it, for I see that that letter grieved you, though only for a while. Verse 12. So although I wrote to you, it was not on account of the one who did the wrong, nor on account of the one who suffered the wrong, but in order that your zeal for us might be revealed to you in the sight of God. So this is how this letter C, which is known as stern letter or letter of tears, referred here in 2 Corinthians. And this letter mainly deals with the problem of false teachers who are attacking Paul, who rejected the apostleship of Paul, who rejected the gospel preached by Paul. But there are many scholars who speculate that this is probably preserved in part with 2 Corinthians chapters 10, 11, 12, 13. So these four chapters of 2 Corinthians is said to be this stern and letter of tears. Now what is the letter D? The fourth letter. Now later Titus returns to Corinth and finds that the Christians have changed, reconciled, and are very good now. Now see, when Titus went previously, the response of the Corinthians was very negative. They did not respond to Titus well. And even while Titus was there, Paul visited, and even Paul experienced the same negativity. So Corinthians have changed so much. Corinthians who had very close and cordial relationship with Paul turned against. So in a grief, he goes back. Now later again Paul sends Titus. So Titus returns to Corinth, and now the situation is different. The Corinthians have changed now. They have reconciled and are very good now. So this was probably the effect of the above letter. So Titus brings this good news to Paul, and Paul is very happy, of course. So out of this joy, Paul writes this letter, which we can call letter D. And this letter is known as a glad letter, joyful letter, happy letter, because of course Paul is very happy to hear about the change of the Corinthians. So it is mainly the first part of the second letter to the Corinthians. So that is chapter 1 to 9 of 2 Corinthians plus chapter 13 verses 11 to 14 is said to be this joyful, happy letter. So in this letter, Paul appears to be reconciled with the church at Corinth, following the return of Titus from Corinth, of course, who came to Paul with a very positive report, with a joyful news. That is referred here in 2 Corinthians 7:6. Let us read. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 6. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. So this is a reference that Paul mentions. So Titus came back with joyful news about Corinthian church and the community. Thus, the two letters that we have contain the portions of a few other letters of Paul. So they are all combined together. Paul must have written not only 4 letters, probably even more letters, but famously many scholars say that Paul had written 4 letters, and all these 4 letters are incorporated into the 2 letters that we have at present. St. Paul's first letter of Paul to Corinthians and second letter of Paul to Corinthians. So all the letters of Paul are actually contained within these 2 canonical letters that we have at present in our Bibles. Now let me give you a synthesis or a synopsis of 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians, Paul provides us with historical insight into the early Christian church. It was a church without any single supreme authority. The missionaries, as preachers who spread the gospel in the decades after Jesus, were by no means homogeneous in their approaches to Christian doctrine and practice. Now, in the beginning chapters of the letter, Paul speaks of divisions in the church at Corinth that emerged from perceived differences in the gospel as preached by various missionaries. It seems that Paul, Apollos, and Cephas each had adherents, followers in the Corinthian church. And so it is possible that the recent converts who were inadequately instructed in Christianity simply misunderstood these missionaries and believed doctrinal differences to exist. So it's also possible that there were actual important differences between the Christianity of Peter and that of Paul. And then Paul enumerates various immoral tendencies of the Christian at Corinth in chapter 5 and 6. He cautions them to condemn sexual immorality and discusses about an immoral person, how to resolve personal disputes, and about sexual purity within the church. Then, in response to the questions posed by Corinthians themselves regarding marriage in chapter 7, Paul states that it is better for Christians to remain unmarried, but that it is better to marry than sin. So, Paul also insists unmarried people must please God, just like married people must please their spouses. Further, Paul advocates themes of unity and freedom of conscience within the bounds of faith. Now, this freedom of conscience extends from doctrinal issues to questions of practice. For instance, Paul permits the Corinthians to eat food sacrificed to idols, while he also says it is best to avoid offending people and to respect the consciences of others. Then Paul also gives or speaks about the great commandment of love in chapter 13. Paul hopes that love will bind the community together despite its differences and lead people to achieve faith and godliness in anticipation of the imminent second coming. Now, towards conclusion, Paul reminds the Corinthians of their core Christian doctrine, namely resurrection of the dead. And Paul tells the Corinthians not to chastise the people for their moral misdeeds. And in a way, Paul assumes the voice of a stern but a loving parent. He writes in chapter 4 verse 15, "In Christ Jesus I became your father." And in chapter 3 verse 2, "I fed you with milk." So these express the cordial and close relationship of Paul with the Corinthians. Now, unlike many of the early Christians, Paul is willing to accept Gentiles as well as Jews, inclusiveness. But acceptance does not mean tolerance of repeated misdeeds and the refusal to repent. So Paul clearly says in 5:13, "Drive out the wicked person from among you." And this letter is considered a complex letter since it appears to be made up of 3 or 4 different letters, as we have discussed in the textual issues of the letter. So here Paul's apostleship was being challenged as weak and lacking power by traveling missionaries who had come to Corinth and one following among the Corinthians. And Paul's heart is wide open to the Corinthians, and he speaks honestly about his personal joy in his calling. And he asks the Corinthians to reciprocally open their hearts and to treat him honestly and to judge him fairly. So this is the synopsis of the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians.